Israel may have just undone decades of US policy in the Middle East with its airstrike on the capital of Qatar, Doha, on September 9th. That airstrike changed the name of the game in the Middle East and completely undermined the central premise of the alliance between the Gulf states and the US. Now, that might all seem a bit confusing and a bit like an exaggeration, but it's really not, and today I'll explain why. So, welcome to Varied Origins, let's get into it. So right off the bat, the situation is that we have a major US ally bombing the territory of another major US ally. Now, Israel wasn't targeting Qatar itself, it was after the leadership of Hamas, which has been hosted by Qatar for over a decade, as Qatar plays this unique role of working with groups that not many other countries, especially US allies, want to. It also places the country in an ideal position to be a mediator, which is exactly what its position is right now, being the middleman between Israel and Hamas on negotiations over Gaza. Hamas's leadership was gathering in Doha to discuss the latest ceasefire proposal, but it seems that the Israeli leadership had a different idea of how diplomacy works. Now, on its face, Israel is going after Hamas, a group that massacred 1,200 Israelis on October 7, 2023, kicking off a series of wars that have led Israel to bomb 4 separate countries throughout the region. So it might seem just like more of the same, but what's really different about this bombing is that it happened on the territory of a major US ally, Qatar, which hosts the US's largest military base in the Middle East and has extensive defense ties with the US, buying billions of dollars worth of equipment from it. The attack completely tears up the reasoning behind the US's alliance with the Gulf states. And when I say the Gulf states, what I'm referring to are Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman. Although technically Iraq and Iran are also Persian Gulf states, but I'm leaving them out of this simplification umbrella. Now, the relationship between the US and the Gulf states is actually quite simple. What it boils down to is that the Gulf states have a lot of valuable natural resources, but they have really small populations, and so they're unable to raise large armies to protect those resources, as they're looking for a protector somewhere else, and here comes Uncle Sam with his bloated military budget. It started when President FDR met Saudi Arabia's King Abdulaziz back in 1945 to strike an oil for protection deal which has been in place for 80 years. That relationship has continued even after the US reduced its dependence on oil from the Persian Gulf. And the Gulf countries went on to become some of the wealthiest in the world and invested hundreds of billions of dollars into the US economy and purchased billions of dollars worth of military equipment to continue gaining favor with the US to protect against their much bigger and aggressive neighbors like Iraq and Iran. Actually, the first Gulf War in 1991 is a perfect example of the relationship. Saddam Hussein invaded and annexed his resource-rich but weak neighbor, Kuwait, and the US led an international coalition to kick his army out. And so that's emblematic of the alliance as a whole, with the Gulf states seeking to essentially buy a close relationship with the US and use it as a shield. It's why the US's 5th Fleet is based in Bahrain and why Qatar is host to Al Udeid Air Base, the forward headquarters of the US's Central Command that coordinates all US military action in the Middle East. Okay, so that's the Gulf state-US alliance system. Now, if I try to summarize the other major US alliance in the region, Israel, in a short video like this, well, I just can't, because the US-Israel relationship is a lot more dynamic than a simple oil for protection deal. So I'm going to oversimplify it and say essentially that the US just gives Israel a lot of weapons, and then Israel just does whatever it wants with those weapons. Usually really pissing US presidents off in the process, but the weapons just keep flowing. So for most of their existence, those two alliances existed in completely separate worlds. While Israel is hated by most countries in the region, the Gulf states adopted an official policy of non-engagement, not recognizing Israel and not taking any direct hostile action against it. But that non-engagement has changed a lot over the years, especially during Trump's first term when he struck the Abraham Accords, which sought to normalize ties between Arab countries and Israel, which led to 2 Gulf states, Bahrain and the UAE, recognizing Israel officially. At the same time, Israel's ties with the heavyweight in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, became closer and closer, and there was an expectation that the kingdom would eventually join the Accords. But then the October 7th attacks changed everything. Since those attacks, Israel has been on an absolute war path throughout the region, bombing its enemies in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Yemen, and now Qatar, with a level of brazenness that hasn't been seen in decades. So after years of the US's 2 most important alliances in the Middle East growing closer together, they're now suddenly in direct confrontation. While the Qatari state was not the target of the strike, it's a massive affront to Qatari sovereignty. Just imagine Russia bombing central New York or London while Zelensky was visiting and assassinating him. And the most important part is that Qatar is not like those other countries. It's a major non-NATO ally of the US. which doesn't mean that the US was legally obligated to protect it, but there is certainly an expectation that being so close to the US at least prevents you from being attacked by other US allies. And Qatar actually has major international clout, unlike Yemen or Syria or Lebanon. It just hosted the World Cup. The complete inaction of the US, which has extensive air defense coverage in Qatar, just called into question the entire premise that being an ally of the US buys you some form of protection, which is essentially the strategy of every single Gulf state. So now the Gulf states will be asking themselves what they're getting in exchange for all of the billions that they invest in the US and all the billions of dollars that they buy in American weaponry. Trying to predict what happens from here is complete guesswork. Maybe the Gulf states nervously assume that the US's inaction was a one-time thing and business goes on as usual. Or on the dramatic side of things, perhaps the Gulf states conduct a strategic realignment away from the US, completely gutting the US's alliance system in the Middle East. Now, you might be wondering about that first point. Why would the incredibly wealthy Gulf states continue to rely on the US after its reliability was just called into serious question? Well, like I mentioned earlier, the Gulf states have bought a ton of American weaponry, like aircraft and air defense systems, and they haven't really looked elsewhere. Transitioning away from American weaponry towards another supplier like China or Russia would be an incredibly difficult thing to do because of the way that the US sells its weapons. If a country buys a fighter jet from the US, it needs the US to maintain the aircraft and supply spare parts, because the US is the only supplier of advanced parts like jet engines for its aircraft. So in order to keep that fighter jet operational, the country in question needs to be in good relations with the US. So if a country like Qatar or Saudi Arabia that composes a large part of its air force and air defense of American equipment were to suddenly be cut off from American maintenance and spare parts, then those systems would eventually become useless. Maybe not right away, but certainly after a few years. And it would take years for the Gulf states to find a new supply of weaponry like Russia or China and to purchase, take delivery of, and become proficient in these new weapons. So if the Gulf states suddenly ruin their relationship with the US, then they'd likely be leaving themselves vulnerable to attack from foreign countries for at least a period of time. Now, they could potentially try to hold on to their US alliance while also diversifying their weapons suppliers to US allies like Turkey and South Korea, but it's a big unknown if those industries could meet their needs. An even better alternative for them would be developing a domestic arms industry to make their own weapons. But arms industries capable of producing advanced fighter jets and air defense take decades to develop, so it's a bit unrealistic for now. So the Gulf states are going to have some serious thinking to do now. If you enjoyed seeing why, please like and subscribe. See ya.